In 1910, a quiet town nestled in the countryside saw the arrival of a stranger that would soon disrupt its peaceful rhythms. The man, appearing humble yet composed, introduced himself as a newly appointed priest. He arrived with nothing more than a small satchel, claiming to have been sent from the bishop. His appearance was immaculate, dressed in the familiar black vestments, his demeanor calm and reassuring. At first glance, he seemed to be the answer to the parish's prayers, a priest to guide them through times of uncertainty. No one in the community questioned his sudden arrival. The stranger wasted no time in establishing his place within the church. He quickly gained the trust of the elderly members, spending hours in quiet conversations, offering prayers and counsel. His natural charisma made him approachable, and the townsfolk, eager for spiritual guidance, welcomed him with open arms. Every Sunday, he delivered passionate sermons that left the congregation spellbound, creating a deep connection with the community. He appeared to embody everything the parish had been missing, and as his presence became more ingrained, the doubts about his authenticity seemed to fade away. Over the following weeks, the stranger's role expanded beyond that of a simple priest. He began managing church funds, taking on the responsibility of overseeing the parish's financial records. It wasn't long before he was entrusted with handling important documents and other sensitive matters, including the safekeeping of parishioners' wills, a practice that was common for the elderly in the town. The man's ability to maintain such a level of trust was nothing short of extraordinary, and no one ever suspected he was anything but a devout servant of God. Yet behind his warm smile and eloquent prayers, something far more sinister was beginning to take shape. Despite his outward charm, the stranger's past was a mystery, and no one bothered to dig deeper. He had no known family or prior connections in town, and no one bothered to question where he had come from or why he was so willing to take on such a large role in the church so quickly. His background, if ever checked, appeared flawless. It was as though he had appeared out of nowhere, as if ordained by fate itself. But in truth, the stranger's story was built on lies and deception. His credentials were fabricated, a carefully crafted illusion designed to conceal his true nature. The first few months were filled with nothing but positive impressions of the new priest. Families began to rely on him for their most personal matters, seeking his advice not only for spiritual guidance, but for financial and legal issues as well. Unbeknownst to them, the stranger had already begun planting the seeds of his deception, manipulating the trust he had built to gain access to the very documents that would help him execute his plan. The parish, eager for a priest they believed was trustworthy, had unwittingly welcomed a thief into their midst. As the weeks turned into months, the new priest slowly began to integrate himself further into the fabric of the parish. His charm and seemingly selfless dedication to his role made him an irreplaceable figure in the church. His sermons became more captivating, drawing in larger crowds, and his personal interactions with the townsfolk grew increasingly intimate. He wasn't just a priest anymore. He had become a trusted advisor to nearly every household in the parish. People sought him out not only for spiritual guidance, but also for counsel on personal matters. His ability to listen and offer wisdom made him an invaluable part of their lives. With this growing influence, the priest found himself taking on more responsibilities. He began overseeing the church's finances, a task that was usually entrusted only to those with a long history in the community. But no one questioned his authority. After all, he was a priest, a man of God. The parishioners, many of whom were elderly and somewhat vulnerable, relied on him more than ever. He handled donations, the upkeep of the church, and even the disbursement of funds for the town's charitable efforts. In his hands, the church's operations seemed to flourish, but his real intentions were far from divine. His relationships with the elderly members of the community became particularly significant. The priest's warmth and attentiveness were exactly what these parishioners needed, many of whom were isolated or had no family nearby. He spent hours with them, offering prayers, comfort, and companionship. He quickly positioned himself as a trusted confidant, someone who understood their fears and desires. And it wasn't long before his attention turned to their most valuable possessions, their wills and estate documents. As he became more ingrained in their lives, they began to trust him with the legal matters they had kept close to their hearts for years. The priest's access to these sensitive documents was seamless. He began offering to keep them safe for his parishioners, many of whom saw it as a simple, convenient gesture. After all, who better to entrust such important papers to than a man of the cloth? The elderly, many of whom were nearing the end of their lives, believed they could rest easy knowing that their final wishes were in good hands. Little did they know that their trust was being manipulated and that the priest's true motives were far more nefarious. While he provided them with comfort, he was quietly gaining control over their estates. Behind the scenes, the priest began to implement his plan. He started forging relationships with those who had substantial estates, making subtle overtures to ensure that he was included in their future plans. Some parishioners, particularly those without families, were eager to include him in their wills, believing that he would be the one to carry out their final wishes. He played his part well, listening attentively to their desires and promising to carry out their instructions faithfully. What they didn't realize was that he had no intention of honoring their requests. Instead, he saw these opportunities as stepping stones to a larger, more personal gain. As his influence continued to grow, the priest's manipulations became more sophisticated. He would subtly advise his parishioners to make changes to their wills, suggesting beneficiaries who were either non-existent or completely unrelated to their families. The elderly, trusting his wisdom and authority, readily agreed to these changes, unaware that their intentions were being carefully altered to benefit the priest. What had once been a simple gesture of goodwill was now a series of well-orchestrated deceptions, all aimed at securing his future. The priest was no longer just a man of faith, he was a man of greed, carefully constructing a network of stolen estates. The parishioners were oblivious to the growing web of deception. As the priest became more involved in their personal lives, he began to remove himself from suspicion, reinforcing the belief that he was truly an innocent, benevolent figure. He cultivated relationships not only with the elderly, but also with their families, convincing them that their loved ones were in good hands. His ability to weave a narrative of trust and compassion was flawless, allowing him to operate undetected for months, even years. His influence was absolute, and anyone who might have questioned his methods was either charmed into silence or too intimidated to speak out. Eventually, it became clear to the audience that something sinister was afoot. The priest's growing control over the lives and estates of the elderly members of the parish was not a coincidence. Behind his friendly demeanor and caring nature lay a carefully constructed plan to deceive and steal from those who trusted him most. The web of manipulation was vast, and the full extent of his actions had yet to be revealed. As the community continued to place their faith in him, they remained unaware that the very man they trusted was orchestrating a grand theft right under their noses. The pieces were in place, and the parish's darkest secrets were about to come to light. The first sign of trouble emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly. When one of the elderly parishioners passed away, the community was shocked to learn that his will, which had been carefully placed in the church's safekeeping, was nowhere to be found. At first, it seemed like an unfortunate oversight, perhaps misplaced in the shuffle of papers or hidden by a careless hand. However, as the parishioners began to search, they realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. More wills, equally entrusted to the church, had gone missing as well, sparking whispers of foul play. The peaceful town that had trusted the church with their most important documents was now on edge, but no one knew who or what to blame. At first, suspicion hovered in the air like a dense fog. The parish leaders began to question their own practices, wondering if the wills had simply been lost in the clutter of church records. But the more they dug, the clearer it became that something was wrong. Documents that had been entrusted to the church for years had disappeared without a trace. The missing wills weren't just a few stray papers. They were important, legally binding documents, some of which named the church itself as a beneficiary. The real scale of the situation started to take shape, and with it, a creeping sense of dread. The trust that the parish had placed in the priest began to erode, but no one dared to speak up yet. The priest, ever the calm and reassuring figure, continued to ease the growing concerns of the parishioners. He brushed off the missing wills as mere administrative errors, assuring the community that they had no reason to panic. "Sometimes things get misplaced," he said, "but rest assured, we'll find them." His smooth words and unwavering confidence masked the growing unease in the church. With every passing day, more wills seemed to vanish into thin air, but the priest's presence kept the parishioners from questioning him directly. He maintained his position as a figure of trust, all while the thefts continued under his watchful eye. Despite his reassurances, cracks began to form in the priest's carefully constructed facade. The more the parishioners dug into their records, the more glaring the problem became. It wasn't just a case of a few missing documents. It was a coordinated effort, spanning months, possibly years. Some began to speculate that the priest had been involved in the thefts, but no one had any concrete proof. It was a difficult thing to accuse a man of God without solid evidence, and so, for the time being, suspicions remained just that. Suspicions. The priest, still in good standing, seemed unfazed, but the mounting tension was palpable. The situation worsened when another will was discovered to be altered. The beneficiary named in the document was not the deceased's intended heir, but rather the priest himself, a name that had been carefully inserted into the document with subtlety and precision. This discovery sent shockwaves through the parish. Waves. How had the priest managed to not only access the wills, but also change their contents? The question of how he had orchestrated such a brazen act of manipulation now loomed large, casting a long shadow over his once pristine reputation. There was no longer any doubt. Something sinister was afoot, but the full extent of the priest's actions had yet to be uncovered. As word of the altered will spread, the tension in the parish reached a breaking point. A group of concerned parishioners, led by a few family members of the missing wills, demanded an official investigation. The priest, however, continued to deny any wrongdoing, maintaining his composure despite the growing accusations. He claimed that the church's records had been mismanaged and that any alterations were the result of simple mistakes. His explanations sounded convincing to some, but others were not so easily swayed. The cracks in the priest's story were starting to show, and the town's faith in him was beginning to waver. In an attempt to cover his tracks, the priest began to act more defensively, tightening his control over the church's operations and limiting access to certain documents. The more he tried to hide, the more suspicious his actions became. His previously open demeanor now seemed forced, as though he was trying to maintain a semblance of authority while hiding his true intentions. The more the parish investigated, the more elusive the truth became. It was clear that someone had been carefully pulling strings from the inside, but uncovering the truth seemed impossible. The mystery deepened, and the stakes grew higher with each new discovery. As the investigation deepened, so too did the mystery of the missing wills. Parishioners began to ask questions, their trust in the priest eroding further. How had he managed to gain such unchecked access to their personal documents? Why had so many wills gone missing, and what had happened to them? The more the community sought answers, the more the priest seemed to distance himself from the investigation, all the while continuing to reassure them that everything would be okay. The missing wills were no longer just a small problem. They were a glaring sign that something much darker was taking place within the walls of the church. Several weeks after the discovery of the missing wills, a group of parish leaders gathered to discuss the growing suspicions surrounding the priest. The parishioners had been uncomfortable for some time, and the constant disappearance of important documents weighed heavily on their minds. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, the church leadership decided to conduct a full review of their records. It was a decision that would soon unravel a shocking truth. The safe that had long been under the priest's care, where the wills and other sensitive documents were stored, would now be opened, and its contents would reveal a depth of betrayal no one could have foreseen. When the safe was finally unlocked, the sheer extent of the priest's deception became painfully clear. Inside, instead of the trusted documents that should have been there was only chaos. Dozens of missing wills, each belonging to different families, were nowhere to be found. Many of the papers that remained were marked with discrepancies, altered signatures, names inserted where they shouldn't be, and dates that didn't align. It was clear that the priest had been quietly using his position to steal these valuable documents, manipulating them for his own gain. His forgery had been so skillful that the church had never suspected a thing until now. Among the most troubling findings were the wills that had been altered to name the priest as a beneficiary. Families who had entrusted their most precious possessions to the church were now faced with the realization that their loved ones' estates had been stolen. The priest had not only taken their documents, but had also used them to redirect the inheritance to himself. The feeling of violation was palpable, as the very man who had been entrusted with their spiritual well-being had also betrayed their trust in the most profound way. The anger and confusion among the parishioners began to grow, and a sense of betrayal washed over the community. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the priest had been meticulously planning and executing his thefts over the course of several years. His position had granted him unrestricted access to the parish's most sensitive information, and he had used this privilege to craft a network of stolen estates, all while maintaining his pious facade. But the deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling it became. The priest had taken such care to cover his tracks that even his closest associates had been unaware of the full scope of his actions. The trust he had earned from the community was shattered, and the church was left reeling from the enormity of the betrayal. While the parish scrambled to understand how they had been duped for so long, they quickly realized that they were no closer to understanding who the priest truly was. His background remained a mystery, and no one had bothered to verify his story when he first arrived in the town. The parish had simply accepted him at face value, believing in his words and trusting him with their most important affairs. But now, as the investigation deepened, it became evident that the priest had no legitimate claim to his position. His identity was likely a fabricated lie, a carefully constructed persona designed to exploit the community's trust for personal gain. The more the parish uncovered, the more the truth seemed to slip further out of reach. The priest, it seemed, had vanished without a trace. His disappearance only added to the mystery. There were no clues to his whereabouts, and no one had seen him leave. His belongings were gone, and it was as if he had simply melted into the shadows. His absence further fueled the suspicion that he had planned his escape long before the church began its investigation. The missing man, who had once been at the center of the parish's life, was now the central figure in a mystery that no one knew how to solve. As the church leaders tried to piece together the details, the missing wills and altered documents continued to haunt them. The more they uncovered, the deeper the layers of betrayal seemed to go. The priest had not only stolen from the elderly and vulnerable parishioners, but had also taken advantage of the trust placed in him by the church itself. The community was left grappling with a sense of profound loss, not just in terms of the stolen estates, but in the destruction of their collective sense of safety and trust. The priest's disappearance only added to the growing sense of unease. The mystery deepened as the parish continued to search for answers. The priest's vanishing act was the perfect escape, but it left behind a tangled web of questions. How had he managed to stay hidden for so long? Who else might have been involved in this elaborate deception? As more families came forward with their suspicions, the investigation grew more complex, and the parish realized that they had unwittingly become part of something far larger than they had ever imagined. The priest was gone, but the damage had already been done, and the search for the truth had only just begun. As word of the scandal spread through the town, it quickly became the talk of the region. The community, still in shock over the revelations, found themselves reeling from the depth of the betrayal. The authorities launched a manhunt, determined to track down the fraudulent priest and bring him to justice. A sense of urgency gripped the investigation, but despite their best efforts, the man remained elusive. The church and the local authorities quickly realized that they were dealing with a master of deception, a criminal who had expertly concealed his true identity for years. Investigators soon learned that the priest's true identity was anything but straightforward. In fact, they discovered that he had a long history of criminal activity, one that spanned several towns and cities. Each place he had visited was marked by his smooth-talking charisma and ability to manipulate those around him. It seemed as though he had been operating under different aliases, carefully constructing new identities as he moved from place to place, leaving behind a trail of stolen wills, forged signatures, and families left devastated by his actions. The depth of his deception was staggering, and it became clear that finding him would be no easy task. As the investigation unfolded, it became evident that the priest had been a skilled con artist long before he arrived in the small town. In each place he had lived, he had used a different name, made new friends, and established a reputation that shielded his criminal activities. He preyed on the trusting, vulnerable members of society, those who were elderly or without family, offering them spiritual guidance while secretly manipulating their most personal documents. By the time the authorities began to dig into his past, he had already left behind a network of stolen estates and broken trust, leaving investigators with little more than a trail of lies and forgeries. The investigators were left piecing together the fragments of the priest's past, but the true extent of his criminal network remained elusive. His aliases had been carefully crafted, and any connections he had made were carefully severed before he moved on. He had managed to cover his tracks so well that even those who thought they knew him best were left in the dark. His smooth exterior, his genuine-seeming compassion, and his ability to blend into any community made it almost impossible for anyone to question his motives until it was far too late. As the authorities dug deeper, they realized they were facing an intricate web of deception that had been spun over the course of many years. With every new lead, the investigation grew more complicated. The parish's leaders and local authorities interviewed dozens of people who had known the priest, but no one could provide a clear answer about his past. Each person had been charmed by him in some way, and they struggled to reconcile the kind, caring man they knew with the person accused of such heinous acts. The priest had been a master at manipulating his image, presenting himself as a humble servant of God while hiding his true criminal nature. His victims had trusted him implicitly, which made it all the more difficult for the authorities to pinpoint where he had gone after disappearing. Despite all the clues and the mounting evidence of his deception, the priest's true identity remained a mystery. He had carefully erased all traces of his previous lives, leaving no solid documentation or witnesses who could link him to his past crimes. Every time investigators thought they had a lead, it evaporated, as though he had anticipated every move they would make. The complexity of his deception was staggering, and with each passing day, the mystery of who he really was deepened. He had vanished without a trace, and the town was left with more questions than answers. As the search for the priest continued, it became clear that the case was far more complex than anyone had initially thought. The stolen wills were just the tip of the iceberg, and the more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that they were up against a criminal mastermind who had been operating in plain sight for years. It wasn't just about a single theft or a single betrayal. It was about an elaborate, far-reaching scheme that had affected countless families across multiple towns. The priest had woven an intricate web of lies, leaving behind a trail of victims who had trusted him with their most valuable possessions. The search for the priest intensified, but as the weeks turned into months, the chances of finding him seemed to grow slimmer. His vanishing act had been flawless, and no one could predict where he might have gone or who might have been helping him along the way. The community was left in a state of disbelief, struggling to comprehend how a man they had trusted so fully could have turned out to be such a skilled and dangerous criminal. While the investigation continued, the priest's identity remained a ghost, an elusive figure whose web of lies had torn apart the lives of those he had promised to protect. Months had passed since the priest had vanished without a trace, and the investigation had gone cold. The authorities had followed every lead they could find, but they had come up empty. The parish was left in a state of uncertainty, with no clear answers about who the priest really was or where he had gone. Families who had been affected by his crimes were left grieving not only the loss of their loved ones, but also the betrayal that had come with it. The case seemed to be on the brink of being forgotten, the mystery fading into the background. But just when it seemed that all hope was lost, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The discovery was made when one of the investigators, going through old records, stumbled upon a letter that had been tucked away in a forgotten folder. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the priest's. The letter was addressed to an unknown recipient, but its contents were nothing short of a bombshell. In the letter, the priest revealed details of his elaborate plan and the steps he had taken to manipulate the inheritance process for his own gain. The letter confirmed what many had suspected. The priest had not been working alone. His actions were part of a much larger criminal scheme that stretched far beyond the town's borders. The priest's letter contained a chilling account of how he had been using the stolen wills to create a network of fraudulent estates. Over time, he had developed a system where he would forge wills, change beneficiaries, and redirect inheritances to himself and his associates. What had initially seemed like isolated thefts now appeared to be part of a coordinated effort to steal from the elderly and wealthy. He had carefully chosen his victims, targeting those who were vulnerable and easily manipulated. The church, which had once served as a place of trust, had unknowingly become a key player in this criminal operation. The revelation in the letter shocked everyone involved in the investigation. It was clear now that the priest had been much more than just a con artist. He was part of a larger, far-reaching criminal syndicate. The operation was sophisticated, involving multiple players across different regions. The priest had likely been recruited by a network of criminals who specialized in targeting the elderly and wealthy, using deception and forgery to siphon off vast sums of money. The letter revealed that the priest was just one cog in a much larger machine, and his actions were part of a calculated effort to exploit the trust of entire communities. As investigators dug deeper into the letter, they began to see how the priest had been manipulating not just the parish, but the legal and financial systems themselves. He had been using his position to influence the wills of wealthy families, ensuring that the beneficiaries named in those documents were often either non-existent or under his control. The complexity of the scheme was staggering, and it was clear that the priest had been working with others who were equally skilled in deception. This new information sent shockwaves through the investigation, raising the stakes higher than ever before. The letter also provided insight into the priest's next steps, which added another layer of urgency to the investigation. The priest had planned his escape meticulously, but he had left behind a trail of clues that investigators could now follow. He had indicated in the letter that he intended to flee the country, but the exact destination was unclear. This revelation gave the authorities a new lead, and they immediately began to coordinate with international law enforcement agencies. The priest's network of criminals had spread beyond the town, and it was now a race against time to apprehend him before he disappeared for good. What was even more chilling about the letter was the priest's tone. He seemed to express no remorse for his actions. In fact, he appeared to view his thefts as a game, a way to outsmart the system and come out on top. His arrogance was evident in the way he described his actions, almost as if he believed that he was above reproach. This lack of empathy, coupled with the scope of his crimes, made it clear that the priest had been a dangerous and manipulative individual who had expertly used his position to carry out his plan without hesitation or guilt. The discovery of the letter added a new layer of complexity to the case. It was no longer just about finding one fraudulent priest. It was about uncovering an entire criminal syndicate. The priest's actions had affected not just a small town, but a network of families and communities across multiple regions. As the investigation shifted gears, the authorities knew they were up against something much bigger than they had initially imagined. The stakes were now higher than ever, and the mystery of the priest's true identity seemed to only deepen with each new revelation. The hunt was far from over, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, one by one. Years had passed since the priest's disappearance, and the investigation had finally been closed. The authorities had combed through every possible lead, interviewed countless witnesses, and pieced together the fragments of the priest's criminal activities. Yet despite their best efforts, his true identity remained elusive. The name he had used, the background he had woven for himself, was nothing more than an elaborate fabrication. The priest had slipped through their fingers, leaving no trace of his past behind. The stolen estates, which had once been the lifeblood of families, were never fully recovered, and the damages were too vast to quantify. While the case had been officially closed, the community could never fully move on. The emotional and financial scars left by the priest's actions remained deeply embedded in the hearts and minds of the parishioners. Families who had trusted him with their most precious possessions were left to deal with the aftermath, trying to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Some still mourned the loss of loved ones who had passed, without ever knowing that their final wishes had been twisted for the benefit of a fraud. The trust that had once been the foundation of the parish was now irreparably broken. The investigation had served its purpose, bringing closure to an otherwise unsolved mystery, but it hadn't undone the harm that had been done. The stolen wills, the altered documents, and the families who had been manipulated remained a painful reminder of the priest's betrayal. The community, once united by faith and trust, was now divided by suspicion. People no longer felt safe in their own homes, wondering if someone they trusted could secretly be plotting against them. The emotional toll of the priest's actions was far-reaching, affecting not just those directly involved, but the entire town that had once called him a friend. Though the case was closed, the ripple effects of the scandal continued to affect the community for years to come. Some families were left in financial ruin, their inheritance lost forever. Others struggled to rebuild their relationships, unable to trust the church or its leaders again. The scandal had shattered the illusion of safety that had once existed in the town, and its people found themselves more guarded and cynical in the wake of the fraud. The church, which had once been the center of the town's life, now stood as a symbol of betrayal, a constant reminder of how easily trust could be manipulated and destroyed. As the years wore on, the memory of the priest's crimes began to fade, but for those affected, it was a wound that would never heal. Some of the families never recovered from the financial losses, while others still grappled with the emotional toll of being betrayed by someone they had trusted implicitly. The priest's actions had not only stripped them of their wealth, but also of their sense of security and faith. The devastation was profound, and even though the case had been solved, the legacy of the priest's fraud would linger long after the headlines had disappeared. The emotional scars of the scandal lived on, passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing the stories of the man who had preyed upon the vulnerable, and the warning tales became a part of the town's folklore. What had once been a close-knit community now looked at each other with suspicion, wary of who might be hiding their true intentions. The lesson of the priest's deception was seared into the collective memory, a constant reminder that even the most trusted individuals could harbor dark secrets. No one could ever forget the devastation that had been wrought by a single man's lies. Though the case was closed in official terms, the trauma it left behind was far from over. The parish was never the same, and the emotional and financial wounds continued to haunt the people who had once trusted the priest with their most personal matters. The trust that had been shattered could never fully be rebuilt. The scars remained visible in the strained relationships and the broken families who would never recover from the devastation. The priest's identity may have remained a mystery, but the damage he had done to the community would echo for generations to come. In the end, the case was closed, but the legacy of the fraud remained, an indelible mark on the town and its people. Though the truth had come to light, the priest's actions had left an irreversible impact. The lesson, painful as it was clear. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. The community would forever carry the weight of the betrayal that had rocked their world, leaving them with a lingering unease about the fragility of the trust they placed in others and the dangerous power of deception.